decades in several degrees. And so that's what we're doing today. My stream wasn't setting up right in YouTube. I'm also over on YouTube. And so that was giving me a little bit of a pause because technologically I'm challenged as a Gen Xer who grew up backwoods and off grid. I don't really understand half of it anyways. I have a couple of rules within the chat within my space. I have moderators in here and they'll take care of a lot of the stuff. If they can't, if I don't have a lot of moderators in here, if chat gets too bad, I'll turn off comments, and I'll turn them back on so people can ask questions. But I turn off comments because I don't deal very well with racism in my chat. We're going to talk about how the theory of race was debunked and how it's a theory created by Europeans to kind of justify their own atrocities. And we're going to talk about how race doesn't exist. Culture and ethnicity exist, and racism actually absolutely exists, right? We're going to talk about how race doesn't exist. So I don't really deal well with racism in my chat. Same thing is I don't deal well with phobias based on gender, desire, or religion. I prefer to call race a colonial construct because the colonizers use it more than a social construct. Othering is a social construct, and race is a part of othering, but it's more of a colonial construct in my mind. I don't deal very well with phobias based on gender and desire and religion either. Gender is my mind. It has nothing to do with your perception. Biological sex, there's 3 biological sexes actually, male, female, and intersex. And intersex makes up roughly 2% of the population. 2% of the population is redhead, and 2% of the population have green eyes. They're not the same 2%, but it might give you an idea of roughly how much of the population is actually biologically intersex. And the phobia or the idea that there's only 2 biological sexes is really new, and it's really a method of controlling you. So utilizing it really isn't the best possible thing. Same thing with phobias based on with desire, right? The idea that you can only be attracted to a person of what I might perceive to be the opposite biological sex from you is really new and really about controlling you. And phobias based on religion, I don't want to hear about your God one way or the other. Really don't. I think that he's a narcissist. I don't care. Leave him out. But hating people based on their belief in him and the way they believe in him is just absolutely ridiculous on every level, and I don't want to deal with it. So keep those out as well. With all of that, let me go ahead and talk a little bit about today's subjects and what's going on. Yesterday, we were talking about the 7 cousin species and the 7 ghost species. And just to briefly go over those, we see that there are 7 different species that are alive that we probably came in contact with during our time on Earth and during our time that we're moving across Earth, from Neanderthal to Homo florensis to Homo denisovan to Homo naledi to Homo longi to Homo luzonensis. And then there's a new one called HLD6. We haven't even named this one yet. And this is out of Asia 300,000 years ago. And it's actually really, really curious because it has our flat face and the start of a chin, though it has some very Homo erectus features and some very other species features, right? So we're not sure who this one is yet. And it's only been published on within the last few months. And then we talked about ghost species. And ghost species are species that we see a little bit of a fragment of their DNA. You know how people will have like 2% Neanderthal or 1% Neanderthal or 6% Neanderthal, which is about the highest percentage of Neanderthal, and how some people will have like 1% of Denisovan or 6% of Denisovan. We see fragments like that of species that we haven't found the whole genome of yet. We don't know who this species is, and so we call this a ghost species, kind of like your ghost in the shell, right? This is our ghost of our past. This is some species that we came in contact with that actually really just enveloped within us. And we see these ghost species in specific spaces across the planet. There's only 2 populations, 2 communities that don't have Neanderthal DNA. The Kwe people of South Africa and the Yoruba people of West Africa, geographically challenged, I apologize. And those 2 communities, instead of having Neanderthal, they have 3 ghost species within them. Everybody else has Neanderthal prior to colonization. This is all stuff taken from skeletal finds prior to colonization, right? So Everybody else has Neanderthal prior to colonization, and a few people in Southeast Asia and the islands of Denisovan and the islands of the South Pacific and Turtle Island and Abiyala, the people all in those spaces have Denisovan within them, right? There's a ghost species as well in Indigenous Australians, and another ghost species in Turtle Island and Abiyalian Indigenous people. Turtle Island is North America, and Abiyala is South America. They are one of the phrases used by Indigenous nations across these spaces to refer to these spaces, one each. There's about 5 or 6 in each space. And obviously, Turtle Island is an English translation. So there's one within Turtle Island Indigenous and Abiyalian Indigenous people. And then we also see 2 ghost species within Neanderthals and Denisovan, and we haven't found those ghost species in the fossil record yet. So they're ghost species. This is our 7 cousin species and our 7 ghost species. In all of my sources, I have compiled bibliographies on the website that you can actually see as the background on my YouTube right now, but is also the website that there's a link of in the bio. And this website just compiles an article here and an article there that you might be able to access, maybe one on each thought process. And some of the articles may contradict what I say, but one of the things might actually be supportive of what I say. And what's supportive of what I say is in a different article, because that's kind of how science works when you compile them all together. So those articles are all meant to be like jumping off points for you, because we all learn better when we actually can think for ourselves, when we're curious, when we're learning ourselves, when we're seeking it, we're looking for it. When we have that quest for knowledge on ourselves, we actually learn better. So they're all like jumping off points for you to go and find more information on all of these things. And again, you can find them all on the website in my bio, widdaord.com. So those were the ghost species and the cousin species. The other topics we didn't really get a chance to get to yesterday, so we're going to talk about some of the other topics today. I can start from the top or I can start from the bottom. Let me go ahead and start from the bottom, because I think this is a really important one. Western-based agriculture is monocrop agriculture. And what monocrop agriculture does is it comes into a space and it takes all of the surface of that space away. And that's that tilling of the ground, right? We all know this, that it may slash and burn trees. It may cut everything down. It may burn prairies, and then it tills the ground and it takes the first layer of soil away. And sometimes it'll till it back into the space, right? But it takes all of the nutrients and the growing things that provide nutrients in that space out of that space. And then it brings in a singular item and plants it and decides that it's got to nurture it, and it has to remove all the different plants that grow in that space, right? Weeding. And then it harvests those things, right? And usually sometimes it will put it back into the soil when it's harvested. Usually they'll kind of pull it all out. Like I harvest my stuff, like say I'm harvesting from, a plant that doesn't regrow. Say I'm harvesting potatoes. I'm going to pull all of those potatoes out, right? Now I'm going to then take a potato and I'm going to cut it up and I'm going to replant it. But I'm going to take all of what was there out. Sometimes I'll retill the leaves back in the soil, but not all the time, right? So as I'm doing this, I am robbing all the nutrients from the soil that I can possibly have and putting something into the soil that soaks up nutrients, that needs nutrients, that all of those different things feed, that all of those different things interact with, that all of those different things help grow, right? And as I'm removing the nutrients and replacing it with this thing sucking up all the nutrients over time, there's no nutrients left in the soil. There's about 80 different pages on that. Maybe you're not looking in the right space. Hey, Obsidian. Like, But thank you for the comment. My website is well up to date. You're welcome to look again if you're not finding what you need. And since you're taking everything out of that space and you're putting stuff in that's soaking up all the nutrients in that space, over time, there's no nutrients left in that space. And that space turns dead. Now, the first time we tried agricultural city growing, like having a city based on monocrop agriculture, is a city called Engazal along a river in Jordan. And I do not remember the name of the river off the top of my head. I knew it before, but it's not there today. And Engazal is still there, but it's died out and been rebuilt many, many times. And the first iteration of Engazal is roughly 9,000 years ago. And 9,000 years ago, Engazal was a thriving city. They came in and they ripped everything out of this fertile valley, and they planted their stuff, and they put their animals, their sheep and goats, the different things that they're herding up in the hills around. And the sheep and the goats and all the different things that they're herding eat everything that's left that they haven't ripped out of the soil and replaced with wheat and barley. So this city, after 300 years, takes this very fertile valley, and turns it into a desert wasteland. And the city fails and they have to leave. And it takes a few hundred years. Actually, I think it's 1,000 between the first iteration of Engazal and the second iteration of Engazal at least. And it takes that time for that valley to regrow, to be fertile, to be okay again. We see the same thing has happened within Turtle Island. You see that many of the prairies were ripped out, and in the prairies being ripped out and being planted, that soil became dead for a long period of time, right? And we see the same thing is happening down in Abiyala, where there are places in the Amazon where they're slash burning forests, ripping out all the nutrients, and we're losing environment, and spaces are turning into a hectic space, right? Like they're turning dead, they're turning problematic. So Western-based agriculture, monocrop agriculture, works in one space in the world, and the space that it really starts, and this is along the Nile. We see that it starts along the Nile roughly 18,000 years ago. And when we see it starting along the Nile roughly 18,000 years ago, it works along the Nile. Denny is who's in the background. And when it works along the Nile is because the Nile itself floods every year. And in that flooding every year, it replaces the nutrients in the soil. It gives you a better basis of actually, the flood itself has taken up pretty much everything anyways, right? There's barley and wheat that grows along the Nile. So as everything's coming up anyways, as the floods are going through and the floods are replacing the nutrients, if you put the barley and the wheat back in the space that it's already growing and everything else is removed by nature, monocrop agriculture works in this space. It only works in this space. When we try to use it any other space across the globe, we have to develop all of these different ways. And not only do we have to develop all these different ways, but all of these different ways lead us from working from dawn to dusk. Mean that we go from a life of ease, hunting and gathering, where in studies they have shown with even modern day hunter-gatherer nations that the hard workers, the overachievers only work roughly 16 hours a week, right? Taking us from a life of ease to a life where we are hard scrabble working from dawn to dusk and starving half the time. Now, this really helps when you're also trying to control people, right? So we see that Western agriculture becomes something that we base our cities on about 10,000 years ago, with Engazal being the first one, right? 9,000 years ago. And we see during this time period that roughly 10,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, we see violence really starting in the archaeological record. Before about 12,000 years ago, we don't see violence in the archaeological record at all. What we see is out of 2,000 finds that we have, roughly 2% of them have injuries that could possibly be attributed to violence. Now, what do I mean about possibly be attributed to violence? What I mean is if you look like your skull's been hit with a stone, I can't tell you if that stone fell out of a cave or if somebody was holding that stone in their hand and smashed you in the head. I can't tell from this far back, this far away, actually what happened. I just know that a stone hit you in the head. I don't know if that stone was welded by nature. I apologize. This has been my issue with TikTok for a little while. It likes to freeze on me and kick me out of TikTok, and then I have to reload TikTok. I can't tell you if that stone was welded by a human being or if that stone fell from the top of a cave or walking, right? One thing that I remember is roughly 30,000 years ago, there is a spear point in somebody's thigh, but the angle of the spear point doesn't look like somebody else was trying to stab this person intentionally, because the angle of this spear point is coming from the top down and only slightly slanted in. So it's a close to the body almost angle. So it's not a definitive somebody stabbed this person. It could possibly be a flint napping injury where this person's flint slipped and impaled them, and in that impaling, because flint napping is a dangerous sport, in impaling them killed them. Or it could be a hunting accident where somebody stabbing a deer or a rhino accidentally hit their friend, right? So we can't tell because of the way that it's angled, because of what's going on. Okay. So with this, the other words, you make it up as you go. Yes, because I can remember that there's a find from 30,000 years ago, but the rest of it I'm obviously making up. I don't know. I didn't really get a chance to share it out a whole lot. Let me go ahead and finish sharing it out since it's, but I think, I do think I have a couple in here. I don't know why. I think it's because it's a new account that you're not. Anyways, I don't think I do though. Let me go ahead and see if I have, let me go ahead and share it out a little bit more. So when we look at that rise of violence, we see that that rise of violence is happening about 12 to 10,000 years ago, because at roughly 10,000 years ago, we can see that roughly 2% of the fines that we have rises to 18 to 20% definitive violence. There's no mistaking this violence. Some of this violence is such that you'll see things like at, I think it's 10,000 years ago in Kenya, we see that there is a find of 8 people lined up, and they're obviously have their hands tied. One of these 8 people is a woman. They're all sitting cross-legged on the ground, and they've all been hit from behind. So this is absolutely definitive violence. There's no question of whether or not this is a violent act. And so this is where we see that rising coming up at this time when we're starting to look at land more as a property ownership thing than as a belonging to, because we're starting to utilize monocrop agriculture, which not only works when you're ripping everything up, but it only works if that's a space that you possess that nobody else can get to. Thank you, Obsidian, and I appreciate it. I did not realize that, oh, and I wasn't paying enough attention, I know. Thank you, Sin. Okay. So we see that rise of violence starting between 10 and 12,000 years ago. At the same time, we see that rise of cities based on monocrop agriculture. One thing that we see with this early monocrop agriculture-based cities, and we see this in their histories, right? The earliest writings that we have. the earliest writings, think of looking at the sagas, where the sagas are written in like 1291 or something like that, right? We're looking at 300 years after the end of the Viking Age. So the sagas are not written about things that just happened. They're written about things that have been told over time. And then they're written in somebody else's perspective, because during that 300 years, not only had the time, like not only was it 300 years of time change, but the 300 years of change between 1000, right, 1000 and 1291, right? That 300 years is a very impactful time of change for those within the Scandinavian region, because what you're looking at is a time of Christianization. And you're looking at a time of going from the Viking Age, going from a bunch of independent jarls to being kingdoms, right? Because that's what happens during the Viking Age, and at the end of the Viking Age is you see these kings taking over and these kingdoms starting. And so you see this huge shift of tradition and huge shift of culture. So over this 300-year period, the shift of tradition and the shift of culture changes the stories. And it being written down by somebody who is actually not of the same faith, who's trying to eradicate that faith, you see that there are things put in. Like within the sagas, the word troll actually indicates a Sami or a Finn person. And this is because at the time, Snorri is extremely racist, trying to eradicate the Sami people and the Sami people's right to Scandinavia, right? So we see that when you have things written down, an extended period of time and a huge cultural shift after they happen, there are significant changes to the stories. So we must understand that the earliest writings that we have do this as well, because we're seeing significant cultural shifts. And in those significant cultural shifts, it gives some shift to what's happening in the story. We have to look at what they're calling people with a grain of salt, right? So with this, we see that the earliest stories are talking about how kings are developing and how kings are starting cities. And how they're talking about kings are starting cities is their first conversation about kings is conversations about men who all pretty much have the same story. They're put in a basket to float down a river and pulled out by some form of farmer or gardener. And really, they're not the abandoned child of somebody who couldn't feed them, but they're actually the abandoned child of a deity or some far off royalty that once existed. And in this, they have a very hard scrabble childhood, because they have a childhood of monocrop agriculture, which, as we were stating, is not a childhood of leisure like a childhood of hunting and gathering is, but a childhood where you're up before dawn every morning, hard scrabble, digging in the dirt and trying to make sure that you actually have food come harvest, right? But you don't really have a whole lot of food up until then. And so this very hard childhood after being abandoned seems to create a touch of narcissism within these early god kings. They think they're gods, right? That's a little bit narcissistic, especially when we compare this to this hard scrabble childhood of abandonment, being sent down a river to float in a basket, and being raised with a lack of food and a lack of, often lack of kindness in the conversation, right? So within this, we see that they then tend to band together groups of people who have strength, and they use those groups of people that have strength to go around and gather everybody up to build their city. If you follow me and my people will protect you from those who are trying to harm you. And if we're going to go and protect you from those who are trying to harm you and protecting you from those who are trying to harm you, just give us your grain, right? Just give us your grain. I'll pay my troops. And if I pay my troops, I'll protect you from the barbarians in the hills. So this kind of gives this mob boss mentality, right? You're seeing where this protection racket is kind of forming. And the start of this protection racket is very much started with this idea that I need to protect you. Thank you. I need to protect you because if you pay me everything you have, then I can protect you and I can take care of you and I'm rich and it doesn't matter what you are at this point, right? So once we see it go from the barbarians to the hills, this is othering. Somebody mentioned something earlier about somebody was talking about race being a social construct, and I corrected that race in my mind is, well, not corrected. I stated that race in my mind is more of a colonial construct. Othering is a social construct. The need to other, the need to decide that it is your next door neighbor that is going to kill you instead of the government that is draining you and exploiting you for everything you have is the problem, right? And that is very much a social construct. And that social construct starts with hierarchy. It starts with a need to keep me in power. And that need of keeping me in power being a need, or my thought process that to meet that need, as long as you fear me, right? As long as you fear something, right? As long as you're afraid of something else, not fear me, but are afraid of something else, then you'll come to me for protection. And so when we see these, thank you so much. I would agree with that 100%. And no, you're that's the common concept, right? I wasn't trying to like I said, I wasn't trying to correct you, right? That's why I changed saying correct, because I wasn't correcting you. That is the current concept. I personally think of it differently, but I wasn't trying to totally, anyways, when we see this start of othering translates down today, and we see it today in race, actually, right? Othering is that thing that tells me that if I can hate my neighbor, if there's something wrong with my neighbor, if my neighbor is trying to steal from me, then I need to hire you to protect me from my neighbor. I need to pay you taxes so that my neighbor doesn't murder me. I need to, pay you taxes so that you can protect me from the Russians. I need to, ensure that I'm safe by having you create laws for me, right? And all of that is based on this fear that something's going to get you because you're being fed this information. That information, we've called it many things over the course of sociology and history and thought process, but that many of the things are outdated now. And so othering really is the best way to put it, right? Because all it is othering. It's making anybody else other. Yeah. I mean, every single one of us grew up hearing about the war on drugs and having the war on drugs being turned as specific groups of people were where the drugs were coming from. So if we hate those specific groups of people, or we need to hire 150 fucking thousand but officers to send into those regions to keep us safe, when we look at things like that it really is. And it also translates down to the concept of homeless or houseless being the problem, right? Because that's who we're othering, right? Where, how dare you be so exploited by society that there's nothing left within you to give anymore. So now let's just discard you and then blame you for your own discarding, right? Yeah, I have to. It's not fun. Animism is so indigenous. One of the criteria that needs to be met to be indigenous by the UN, right? And the only reason I utilize that is because it is one of the things that is really shared by indigenous culture everywhere and anywhere. And it's one of the foundation things of being indigenous, right? And I state that because there are very few ways anybody is monolithic. Nobody is really monolithic. And even within this, everybody's interpretation of it comes across differently. Animism is the concept that you belong to the earth, right? And that the earth itself is a whole breathing thing, right? And that it has its own soul. that the plants and the animals have their own soul. It's the knowledge that you are just another animal in the scheme of things, right? And the way they word it within the UN guidelines is it's having your spirituality and your community be based on a relationship with the space that you're in, the planet with the space that you're in, right? And so it is one of those things that is pretty global among Indigenous people. This includes prior to this concept, this ideology of ownership of property instead of belonging to property. So when we start doing this monocrop agriculture is really the antithesis of belief that the earth has a soul, right? Yeah, right. So if I believe that the earth has a soul, I can't stab her, right? Like I'm not digging her up. I'm not violent and vicious to her. If I believe that she has a soul, I don't damage, right? And so when I get to this point that I can disconnect earth having a soul into it just being dirt, that there's no soul behind the dirt, right? Then I get to this point that I can own this, and I get to this point of monocrop agriculture, right? And this all kind of ties together. Okay. Now, of course, again, monocrop agriculture works along the Nile. It is a part of how the Nile works. So this does not apply there, right? That concept does not apply there. It doesn't take away the understanding of the land there because it's part of the understanding of the land there, but it is not a part of the understanding of the land in other spaces, right? And so when we get to this point that we believe that we're the only thing that has a soul, we're the only thing that matters, we're top dog, it's our ego, right? It's our belief that for some reason we're the top on the chain, right? Instead of understanding that we're just a cog in the machine, right? That we're just another piece of the puzzle, we're just another niche to be, we just fulfill another niche, right? And so, oh yeah, absolutely. Doing it right now, right? This is that point of chat change though. And the concept before, to answer the question fully, Sin, this is that point of that change, right? And the concept before that is what we would think of today as an indigenous concept. It's animistic, right? It's that interconnection with the world. And it is a global concept. And it stays as a global concept everywhere across the planet until this starts moving in, right? So you see that and there are many ways, or there are many spaces that still have, you don't have to be hunter-gatherer or collector to be indigenous, right? There are many places that do have some form of, it's not typically monocrop agriculture, but have what we would consider agriculture, right? So it's not about the agriculture. It's not about interacting with the earth. It's about the way we view the earth and the way we interact with the earth, right? So it's about ripping everything out and replacing it. There are many different ways that we're doing agriculture across the globe that might look similar, that are instead more in concert with the land, including like Egypt, or along the Nile, where I paused again. Not that anybody's there. And it might take a second to repop. It might take a second to repop. Let me see if I can pull it back up. Yesterday, it was really hard for me to pull it back up. This might pause me again for just a second, and I apologize. Plants are sentient. And you know what else they've been, oh my God. So there's been so many recent things. There's a lot of work with animals recently that has shown a lot of different things. Whales have a syllabic language. Ants perform limb amputations. First, they perform a triage. And if the wound is on the lower part of the limb, instead of amputating it or they'll amputate. No, if it's on the lower part of the limb, they'll clean it because their saliva has cleaning properties. If it's on the upper part of the limb, they'll remove the whole limb. And this is because the blood poisoning entering into the stream from the wound on the lower limb, the way that the circulatory system is for the ant is really fast. And so on the lower limb, they have enough time to clean it until it's disinfected. But on the upper limb, it'll move to their heart too fast or to their central whatever too fast. I don't know if they have a heart. And they will, and so they amputate it because it's quicker to amputate the upper limb. And they survive the amputations. They actually perform fucking full limb amputations in ants, right? And then recently, they have found out that not only do corvids have tools, not only can corvids be taught to talk, but corvids count like toddlers count, and they count to each other. It's amazing how many different, like we have all spent probably the last 200 years with this concept, or 500 years, or maybe a little bit, like I know I'm going to go with 200 years because that's a point where we're seeing the vastest amount of colonization, right? Like most of everything, right? So for the last 200 years, if we're going for an all, most of us have had this concept in our brain that we were set above, that we were, something else, right? That God made us special, right? And this concept within our brain that we're so set above, we're so egotistical about this too. Like we just think that we're the greatest and it just means that we can destroy everything around us. And now science is like, nah. Here you go. There's another, nah. And I'm like, I get excited and giddy and everybody around me is kind of laughing at me. But it's amazing to me. We're so arrogant that we're ignorant, right? We're so ignorant in our arrogance, right? And we take pride in that shit. And it's just like, right? Yeah. So,
Mom,
your son?
do you need the bathroom?
No, I do not.
Okay, I'm gonna take a bath.
Okay, baby.
Love you.
Love you. Has children in house now, so So we do see this rise of violence at 10,000 years ago, and we see associated with monocrop cities with agriculture basics. And we see that rise of violence and the monocrop agriculture-based cities with a hierarchical base have a tendency to use othering. They use this concept that I should fear my neighbor instead of understanding what is going on to kind of keep everybody in check. And they've been using it the entire time. So we're pretty steeped in it at this point. At this point, we're looking at, 10,000 years of everybody pretty much believing that we are insanely, separate and that everybody around us should be somebody we should be afraid of, right? Othering translates from the barbarians in the hills in the beginning. And then when everybody's in kind of nation, city states, it becomes that other nation, city state is out to get you. So we have to go to war to get them first. It's usually about conquering. It's usually about getting more of something. And this is where we really get this start of this agriculture concept is also where we get this concept of being able to hoard and being able to exploit, right? Like I can force you to, whatever we're calling the coin of the realm of the day, right? Like whether grain is the coin of the realm or shells are the coin of the realm or coin is the coin of the realm, right? Whatever we're calling the exchange the day, how can I get the most out of you, right? And we utilize in these early times and to this day, this fear mongering. We see this today in our elections, right? Huge amount of fear mongering in our elections, huge amount of fear mongering in everything, right? And so this is where we see this rise of exploitation and greed. And hoarding comes because you lack. We see this a lot, like you'll see people who lived through the Great Depression actually hoard food. I remember old women when I was young who would have several deep freezes, like those large chest freezers that are like 12 foot fucking long, full to the brim of food and cans and cans and cans and cans. And it's because when they were children, they lived through the Great Depression and they starved. And because of starving, they started hoarding. Hoarding comes from having a lack. You'll see this even today when you get people who are like house hoarders. What it is often they were poor as children and they keep things because they might need them later. As somebody who grew up dirt floor poor, I really work hard not to hoard. And I've actually had to have a couple times in my life where I just got rid of everything I owned. Right before I went to Standing Rock, I got rid of everything I owned because it was time. I had just gotten divorced. And because I literally had a garage full of boxes and I didn't know what the fuck was in everything, because I had spent so much time, this it might not work anymore, but I bet I can use it for something else later that I might need it for later. And if I throw it away, I'm not going to have it when I need it. And I don't have the money to go and buy it. Right. And so you'll see that this is how we hoard. This is why we hoard. When we don't have, when we fear that we're not going to have, if we don't hoard, we hoard. And so we see that this is why we get, now, don't get me wrong, rich people hoard these days for an entirely different reason, right? Rich people hoard these days due to a huge presence of narcissism. If you grew up in the middle of having it all, you don't hoard because you lacked. You might lack other things. You might have lacked majorly for any love or compassion in your life. In the kitchen, I think. He's texting me. You might lack for any love or compassion in your life. And that's why you hoard now, right? But hoarding generally comes from a lack, right? And so we see this early hoarding of money and what is money at the time, grain. Let me make sure that you can't see anything behind me for just a slight second there. And because, kids on the videos, but this early hoarding of grain, right, really comes from that childhood lack that we read about in those stories. And then we get this concept of what can I accumulate? What can I own? We also know that there's a lot of diseases that have entered into our bloodstream that have really changed our propensity for different things. Like the latest studies show that the reason we suffer from depression and anxiety, or the reason that we have like those mutations within our genes that allow for those things, comes from a disease process about 4,000 years ago. So early agricultural cities and cities throughout time, except for indigenous cities that we know of here in Turtle Island and Abya, cities throughout time, even today, lack enough sanitation to prevent disease. Disease becomes really rife in any space that you have a lot of humans living together in close quarters. Add in any lack of sanitation, and that increases exponentially, right? So we see that within these early cities, there is such a rise of disease process within these early cities that they start creating some of these chemical imbalances that we have, right? They start creating the genes for these chemical imbalances. Othering migrates from other nations to my findings, it goes into gender next. We see this rise of this concept of there only being a couple of genders, or one gender being weaker than the other, really rising among the Greeks. And you don't really see it in a lot of spaces before that. In fact, we see that there's a lot of spaces that women are as high ranking, and that the Greeks have a propensity for preteen boys, which are almost a third gender, because they aren't really into, other men, but they look at preteen boys as being almost another gender. And they look at women as being completely not worthy of anything. There are certain groups of Greeks that actually had a lot of pride in their women, but it was very rare. And so this is where we start to see othering start within our communities, right? This started the thought process that it's actually not the other nation state. It's not that outside thing that's going to get you, but maybe, just maybe, it's in your house. Maybe, just maybe, it's somebody right here, right? And then after this, we start to see a rise of othering based on religion. When we start to see when we start to see a thought process of monotheism, right? Though I guess in truth, we actually probably it's a little bit of each with that one, because we start to see this when we see the first act, or the first recorded act of colonization, which would be the manifest destiny colonization of Canaan, present day Palestinians, their ancestors, and that colonization. And that colonization, I think, is recorded, 4,000, 3,000 BC or something like that. And so with that colonization being recorded that long ago, I think that that does predate the Greeks. And so I would state that that colonization and being a othering based on religion within that, you might actually start to see the othering based on religion with that, because you do see it with that start of monotheism. That othering based on religion kind of carries over into race. Early theories of race aren't about science, they're about the Bible. Early theories of the idea that there are different races of men really come from this idea that certain races of men are marked because of certain biblical people's shame or what they did wrong. And so all of certain groups of people are marked by their skin, and they're descendants of certain people, and that marking means that they're races, lesser races of men in God's eyes. So we see this start of this race idea coming within this, but then it really starts doubling down when there's a lack of well, not a lack, but when this shift from believing that the world is 6,000 years old and all based on God to this understanding of science on a Western scale, because science pre-exists Western society. Science is indigenous. It goes everywhere. And the theory of race has been debunked. And actually, the Khoi population, the community of the Khoi people of South Africa, actually possess every single gene within the Homo sapien genome. So they are the original population of Homo sapien by our understanding of science today, because of the fact that if there is a gene within the Homo sapien genome, it is seen within the Khoi population today, and seen in the Khoi population prior to colonization as well. So we're talking about the original population on the planet. Race itself has been debunked. And the idea of the six root races is an extremely racist, problematic concept, and doesn't actually mean what most people mean. For example, Caucasian is brown, not white. You know, most people like to think that Caucasians are white, but Caucasians are actually North Africa, the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and all the way up to the Caucasus Mountains by the original 6 definitions of different races. So if we want to bring that into play, at least let's talk about it honestly and state what it really is, right? Most people actually, storytelling, most people, I've been told that that word is actually considered a slur by the people that it would apply to like the groups that descend from them, the actual groups that descend from them in those areas today. They are Caucasian, right? And a lot, just so you know, and I know that you don't know, or you wouldn't have said it, and I've only recently found that out, and so I have used it plenty of times. In fact, you'll see how I've used it in videos. But I have recently found out, and you know me, if I find out something is, I'm going to let you know. You know, I'm going to try and change my way of doing it, and I'm going to let you know. And I don't think that, I don't think it's a specific group. It was never a specific group anyways, right? They're Arabs. They're North African, Southeast Asia or Southwest Asia, North African Arabs, because the Arabian Peninsula are not Arabs, Muslims, right? Because not all Muslims are Arab and not all Arabs are Muslim, right? But they're Muslim, right? So, but they're a wide variety of people. They come from all over North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and they're a wide variety of physical characteristics because they come from all over North Africa and all over the Arabian Peninsula, right? So that's beautiful. That's an awesome combination. That's a really badass combination. So yeah. And that's only, like I said, just recent find out. But I think that a lot of people don't understand that that's brown people. And So I spent like a year in an Islamic camp at between, I guess it was a couple of summers when I was a child, because there was a camp a school that had come over from Iran, and my parents spent a lot of time. This was about 80, 90 people in a community. My parents spent a lot of time there, and so I went to school there, and I would live up there, and I stayed up there, and that was, a couple of summers, in that time frame. Most everybody looked like me. There were some people that were much darker than me, and some people that were much lighter than me. Like most everybody looked like me, though, right? It didn't occur to me, and I don't think that I've ever. And it's not that I didn't know the archaeological or anthropological terms. I just had never associated it until I was actually in Iraq, and I think that. I think it was actually, instead of being, no, it was in Iraq, because it was at a burn pit, because I guarded burn pits in Iraq. That's kind of what I did. And I would talk to people because I knew a little bit of Arabic, and like I said, I had spent a couple of years in Muslim camp. I had learned Hebrew and Aramaic there, and like different things. And to me, it was a very positive interaction. So I would talk to people, and I saw a lot of redheads, and I was a little bit curious at one point. I'm like, that's a little interesting. And I said something to somebody, and they're like, well, yeah, we're Caucasian. And I went, well, duh, but, well, shit. And it's not like I didn't register that most people from Iran or in Iraq were light of skin already, or at least, parts of them were, because I had grown up with people that had come from Iran, right? And then when I was like 16 and I was taking care of my older sibling's daughter and living with them, there was another group who had come over from Iraq. It's just going to keep doing this. I'll tell you, it's just going to keep doing this. But yeah, so I've known a lot of people from the Middle East growing up. It just had never registered to me the classification, right? But most people don't register that. Caucasian isn't white. Caucasian is shades of darker, right? Like not dark, like kind of this middle shading zone is what Caucasian is, right? You've got, and I'm not going to use all the racist terms that come along this thought process, but Aryan is one of the racist terms that we try not to use anymore because, assholes, is the ultra light scale, right? Caucasian is brown. People don't get Caucasian be brown, right? Not like dark brown, not like light brown, brown. So, and so, yeah, that's a concept for most people. And I think that we need to steer clear of those concepts. We've seen that the theory of race is debunked. Race does not exist. It is a colonial construct or a social construct, and it is created to kind of give you a reason to hate somebody else instead of, which part, Lynn? Right. Well, and like indigenous people in Turtle Island actually range in shades. You'll see people from the farther north, they're actually lighter in shade, and people from the equator are actually darker in shade. We all got a copper undertone, but right. Oh, so about I didn't really state yet about how the theory of race is debunked. Are you talking about the theory of race itself, or are you talking about the different classifications under the construct of race? That's real, Brett. Different classifications. Okay, so when the theory of race is developed in the 1850s, along with the theory of evolution and the theory of eugenics, they start classifying people into different races. The theory of race states that whatever racial classification I put you in by your skin color is going to tell me whether or not you feel pain. It's going to tell me whether or not you have a capacity for intelligence. And it's going to tell me whether or not you have the capacity to work hard, or, just these different things, right? The theory of race states that your skin tone indicates what's underneath, right? It's everything, right? And so when they did this, they come up with 5 different classifications of humans across the planet. And they're I don't like using these terms, and so I'm not going to, but you can look up the 5 classifications, right? It's 5 or 6. I think it started out at like 3 and then they expanded it. And one of them is Caucasian, and it's one that is still regularly used today, but Caucasian actually does not mean white. It means brown, right? The Caucasus region and down. So Caucasian initially, and you can look it up, and what I would look up is original meaning of Caucasian. And Caucasian actually, we will tell you, it was all of North Africa, the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula up to the Caucasus Mountains. And which is an area that we know of today is, I mean, there's many different colors in that area if we're looking at colors, right? I know people from North Africa who are naturally indigenously white, like light of skin, right? And people from North Africa who are naturally indigenously dark of skin, right? And so you can get several different color schemes in North Africa. Neil deGrasse Tyson said it very well when he said Africa is a vast continent and it has every skin color in it, and it has every eye color in it, it has every hair texture in it, and every hair color in it. Africa is a vast continent, right? And that's all pre-colonization, right? We know these things from pre-colonized times. So it is very many different colors within that scheme, but it is browner on the range. Whereas what most people think of when they think of white is actually Aryan. We don't use that so much today because, I mean, all of them are racist, shitty terms, but this one has been used by certain people to be racist. And so we try not to use it, right? Yeah, well, mine are gray. Most people don't realize, like, and they ship, and I've had videos recently, and I'm like, oh, my eyes look real gray in that video, you know. But and we actually see there's actually a lot of light eyes that are gray, which is a shift of blue to green to gray is what gray eyes is. Gray eyes is actually really populous in Turtle Island indigenous people, and you can actually see light eyes all over the Arabian Peninsula. Yeah, yeah. And it was totally scientific racism. And what it was justifying the atrocities they were committing. Now, the theory of race has been debunked. Again, it was the justification of atrocity. They didn't really use a lot of scientific schematics, right? Like they used sheets of paper with different shades of paint, and they'd hold it up, or they'd put a pencil in your hair, or they'd compare your eyeball to a bunch of different colors of eyeballs that they had glass created. And through these concepts, they would, sometimes they would use skull measurements. We call this phrenology or chronology. This is a debunked racist pseudoscience. It does not, like, I have friends that look exactly like me that are extremely dark of skin. And I have friends who look exactly like me who are extremely light of skin. I'm not going to sit here and like change the color of my skin so you can see this. But I mean, I've had people who I'm looking at them and I'm like, that's my nose and my lips and my chip. What? And I'm like, excuse me. And they're like, yeah. And I mean, like, they're good friends. And so like, yeah, but they're, this phrenology and chronology, the idea that the measurement of your nose or your lips or your eyes or your ears has anything to do with your genetics. Like all of this stuff is about alleles. All of this stuff is about different measurements in the DNA. And they don't base themselves on where you're at, except for a couple of them. The only ones that base themselves on where you're at is a child would be born a couple shades darker or a couple shades lighter than their mother, depending on the sun environment, right? That their mother is at in womb, right? And that's pretty much it. Now, they are a protection from the sun, right? Higher melanin per inch protects you better. Doesn't protect you fully. It's not a complete armor, but it does protect you better, right? Higher melanin per square inch in your eyeballs means that it lets less light in. So if there's a lot of light, you can see easier. Whereas if there's not a lot of light, lower melanin per square inch in your eyeballs is going to make it easier for you to see in dappled forests and things like that, right? And, back in the woods. So when we're looking at these things, they're not about who your mother's mother was. They're not about where you came from 10 generations ago. They're not about where you came from yesterday. They're about the space that you're in more than pretty much everything else. Now, there are certain things that absolutely pass along within genetics. And you're going to see that again. So if it's a combination, I think like skin tone is a combination of 9 alleles. And I need to state with all of this that I understand this about this much compared to archaeology and anthropology. I'm not a person who understands a combination of letters and numbers very well. If it doesn't phonetic for me, I am a very verbal person or written person, like words work for me. If it doesn't phonetic, it doesn't work. So this is not my area of expertise or area of focus in any way, not like I consider myself an expert in anything. But what it is there's like your skin tone is a combination of 9 different alleles. And we all have the ability to have all of these 9 alleles. It's how the alleles come forth and how they place in us. Really good example of this is Cheddarman. His direct descendant lives less than a mile from where they found Cheddarman, 300 generations later. And due to the adaptions of time, Cheddarman's alleles for his skin are what we define as sub-Saharan black. Okay, that's the definition. Not sure I like it, but that's the definition. The alleles for his skin are what we define as sub-Saharan black. The alleles for his 300 down generation direct descendant, boy, as white get, like paper, right? And you can, this is 300 generations of adaptation. This is 10,000 years of adaptation. So Cheddarman carried these alleles. I've got to verify that I'm here to continue. Yes. Okay, so Cheddarman carried these alleles with him, and it was through the time within this space that Cheddarman's descendants adapted to give the alleles to his descendant, right? So the idea that all of these things actually play a real part in who we are. Now, don't get me wrong, they absolutely play a part in what we experience in life, especially today. Right? Especially in the times that we live in now, especially within the last 1,000 years. They absolutely play a part in how people interact with us. They absolutely play a part with our life experiences. They absolutely play a part with what we can access. What they don't play a part in is how intelligent we are, how we feel pain, what we are capable of and what we are not capable of. On a physiological level, obviously on a social construct level, absolutely, right? But that is not because of us, that is because of sociology and people being, right? So that's what the theory of race is. It states that all that matters. And it states that all that matters with very made up arbitrary concepts and with pseudoscience that's since been debunked. Now, the theory of race itself was debunked on the fact that out of Africa comes the Whole Genome Project, which is a multicultural project that went and looked at people from primary populations across the globe. A primary population is the original population or a long-term population of a space, right? So people have been in Sweden for, there's 2 groups that came in around the same time between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago, right? So those are 2 primary populations in Scandinavia, in Sweden itself, right? So a primary population that has been around since the dawn of us is the Khoi people of South Africa. Within that primary population lies the genetics of all the genetics on the planet. Now, that doesn't mean that they're grandmother. What that means is that within the modern day population and within the population a couple hundred years ago or the population 1,000 years ago is the whole human genome, all the ability of genes, like all the different genes that can possibly combine and come out are found within the Khoi people, right? So we know that they're the oldest population and that they're what we call the original population. Now, that does not mean that I am a descendant of a Khoi person. I'm not Khoi. They're not my ancestors. The modern day Khoi population is a population that parts of me diverged from 70,000 years ago, and parts of me diverged from 40,000 years ago, and parts of me diverged from 10,000 years ago. Maybe parts of me diverged from more recently. I don't think so, because to my understanding, my grandmother, who comes from Africa, did not come from that region, right? So when we're looking at that, we see that this population in and of itself has all the genes, right? So if they have the genes of all the white people too, right? Well, how are the white people a different race, right? And then what we see is that there's more genetic difference within a primary population than there is between 2 primary populations. And what this means is that you're more genetically different from your next door neighbor than you are from somebody clear across the globe. I wouldn't call myself Black. I have Black ancestry. I have ancestry everywhere. I can trace myself by name and line to every corner of this planet, right? I wouldn't call myself Black because obviously being Black in America is, a specific thing, right? But I do have African ancestry, yes. And I take great pride in my African ancestry. I've known about it since I was a child, and I've known the stories and everything else of where my grandmother came from since I was a child. So it's something of great pride for me, yes. But I wouldn't identify that way just because I'd probably be offensive to people, and I don't want to be offensive. So when we're looking at the differences in populations, having more genetic difference within a primary population than between two primary populations, I'm going to use this in small words, right? Not small words, small numbers, not words, small numbers, because it's easier for my brain to process. If the whole of the human genome is 100 genes, right, and every person in the human population gets 25 genes, and you are a member of the Quay population, you might have genes 1 from 25, and somebody else who lives right next door to you might have genes 75 through 100. Whereas somebody in Sweden whose family has been in Sweden for 8,000 years is also going to have genes 1 through 25. Okay, so you are more genetically similar to somebody clear across the globe than you are to your next door neighbor. Again, this is information that comes out from the Whole Genome Project. You can look that one up. That one's a real simple one. They have a whole page, a lot of information. It's really fucking amazing. I love the Whole Genome Project. And the Whole Genome Project took genetics across the planet and they brought them together. They're out of, if my memory serves, and my memory does not always, so I apologize if not, but I believe they're out of Africa, and they're a multicultural group that has done this. And what they were doing was trying to, bring this concept. And they were also looking at the medical concepts within it, right? Native terrestrial. So this is how the theory of race gets debunked. This is why we know that race itself does not exist. It is a cultural, or I prefer the term colonial concept. Some people say social construct, not concept, construct. I prefer the term colonial construct because it was a construct created to colonize, right? It was a construct created to cause harm, right? You have to get a full genome for most of those for lost family. Okay, so I went to find my bio dad because I didn't know my bio dad, and I figured, between all of it, I was like, I'm going to do this. I had new things, but I have people in my family arguing it. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to find out myself, and then I'm going to find my bio dad. And so I used Ancestry because it was just easiest. And then that's like autosomal DNA, and you can take that and upload it to other websites to find out. On my website that's in my bio under DNA resources, there is Your DNA Portal, GEDmatch, My True Ancestry. On My True Ancestry, which is the bottom one in there, is Nebula Genomics. And Nebula Genomics it's the cheapest I've found for a full genome DNA test. I have not done it yet because I'm a war vet who lives on my disability. And so that's a lot of money for me. But it will give you a full genome test, and that full genome test is the best that you can get for finding out all of your ancestry. GEDmatch is cool, and you're right, it is confusing. There are some things that are confusing. Like you go into the thing that looks like a spreadsheet, and you think it means it's you, and it's not. There are some things that are real on GEDmatch, like there are ones that compare you to graves, and a few of the ones on the website will compare you to graves. And when they're comparing you to graves, what they mean is they're comparing your DNA to that grave. And what they're doing is they're comparing, like, if your mitochondrial haplogroup is... So I have a match to the grave in Switzerland, the BJ581. It's a grave I work, it's a grave I study. So it was fascinating to find out I matched it. But and I have a very close genetic match to it. But it doesn't mean that she's my grandmother. What it means is that the population that she belonged to, maybe the small community or the family line that she belonged to, is my ancestry, right? So Cheddarman has a direct descendant that's there. They traced him through his Y DNA, and he's there 300 generations down. You can do that with Y DNA. You can't do that in any women. You can't do that with mitochondrial DNA. You can only do it with Y DNA. And so they were able to trace his direct descendant. We also know that his mitochondrial haplogroup is the mitochondrial haplogroup for like 13%. That's the same. Sorry. But we also know that Cheddarman's mitochondrial haplogroup is the same mitochondrial haplogroup for like 13% of Northeast European people. So Northwest European people. So with this, when you see that your mitochondrial haplogroup or your DNA might be a genetic match for somebody, doesn't mean that they're your direct ancestor. What it means is that they belong to the community that your ancestor belonged to. Maybe they were a sibling, maybe they were a friend, but they belong to the same haplogroup community that you belong to, right? So, I can go over the ghost species really quick. I see that there's a couple people in there asking. Ghost species are species that we see traces of them in our DNA that we don't see full genomes of them in the fossil record. So we all know like that Neanderthal is like 1 to 2%. Like we all have like 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, except for 2 communities on the planet. The only 2 communities on the planet that don't have Neanderthal DNA prior to colonization are the Kwe community of South Africa and the Yoruba community of West Africa. Everywhere else in Africa, everywhere else across the globe has a minimum of 1% up to, I think 5 is the top percentage of Neanderthal DNA across the planet. And what that is just like a couple of genes. Right? Like you might have a gene, like I have the gene for Neanderthal for dark skin, because Neanderthal, like us, has genes for dark skin and genes for light skin, alleles for dark skin and alleles for light skin. And I have the allele from Neanderthal for darker skin. I have both alleles for darker skin and lighter skin, or I have alleles for darker skin and lighter skin. There's like 9 different alleles in Homo sapiens, right? But obviously the lighter skin is what takes presence in the allele mix up, right? So you might have like different genes or different alleles from Neanderthals within you. We also see that Denisovan is seen in different people across the globe. It is seen in people in Southeast Eurasia, people in the islands of the South Pacific, people in Australia, and people in Turtle Island and Abya Yala being South America and Turtle Island being North America. So this is where we see the other species that we have found in the fossil record that we've gotten a full genetic genome of, right? Like we mapped their full genome, so we know what genes they have. So when we see ACAB, ACAB every day, right? When we see ACAB in our genes, we know that ACAB in our gene comes from Neanderthal, right? So with that, we have genes in ours that aren't Homo sapien genes, that we haven't found a whole genome in the fossil record yet, like we have with Neanderthal and Denisovan. And so we call these ghost species because they're species that we see within us, so we know they existed, but we haven't found their DNA in the fossil record yet. Now, this can be that we found their species in the fossil record and we just haven't been able to get DNA from them, because there's a lot of species that we found in the fossil record that we can't get DNA from because of conditions, right? Or it could be there's species that we haven't found in the fossil record. We have found so Neanderthal was 1850s, right? We didn't see anybody else for 100 years, 150 years. In 2003, we found Homo forensis. In 2010, we found Homo denisovan. In 2012, we found Homo naledi. In 2018, we found Homo luzonensis, and we reclassified someone as Homo longi. And last year, we found HLD6, who hasn't even been given a name yet because it's an entirely new species that we just found, right? So these are all within the last 20 years. So we're constantly finding new species. So these little fragments of genes that are in our DNA that we haven't seen in other species in the fossil record yet could just be that we haven't found the species, or it could be that we have found the species and we can't get their DNA out, right? We just can't map their genome. We see 7 of them. Now, the last one, I'm not exactly sure. It came out in the article with HLD6, which is from China. So it could either be, which I don't think that they mapped HLD6 DNA from what I read from the article. So it could either be in Asia, like in China, and looking at the genetics in China because it's an article about a find in China, or it could be in the Denisovan or Neanderthal DNA, because there's also another one, our 6th, that we have found in Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA, but we have not found it in Homo sapiens, us, right? The 5 that we have found in Homo sapiens that I know for certain are 3 within the Kwe and the Yoruba people, okay? So those 2 communities that don't have any Neanderthal DNA, and again, the only 2 communities on the planet without Neanderthal DNA, those 2 communities have 3 ghost species within them, little fragments of DNA that we don't know where they came from. We know they're terrestrial. We know they're from genus Homo, which means human, but we don't have a full genome of them from the fossil record, so we call them a ghost. We see one of those in Indigenous Australians, and Indigenous Australians have been there for like 70,000 years. There is a site that predates that in Australia. It's 120,000 years ago. So it's very likely that Homo erectus makes it to Australia, and when they kind of adapt in that space, like they've adapted everywhere else across the globe, right? And in that adaptation in that space, when sapiens comes into that space, they meet with the descendant species of Homo erectus that's there, right? And in meeting with that descendant species, they envelop them, because we do that with everyone we meet. That's how come what we did with Neanderthals, we enveloped them within us. What we did with Denisovan, we enveloped them within us, right? There's also a ghost species in Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyalian indigenous people. Again, Turtle Island is North America and Abiyala is South America. These are phrases used by certain indigenous communities in Turtle Island and in Abiyala. There are about 6 or 7 phrases for each continent. These are the ones that are easiest for me, and obviously Turtle Island is a translation, right? So those 5 ghost species that, and with the Turtle Island indigenous and Abiyalian indigenous ghost species, we see sites like the Cerruti Macedon site that are 130,000 years old. And we see other sites that actually predate that here in North America and South America, right? And because of those sites, what we're looking at is it's very likely that Homo erectus makes it here as well. And when they make it here as well, they speciate. And when we get here, we envelop them into us as we envelop everybody else as we're moving across the planet and living in spaces, right? And so this would be the ghost species in Turtle Island indigenous and Abiyalian indigenous, and it would be the species that we see interacting with the Cerruti Macedon site, just like in Australia. It would be the ghost species in indigenous Australians and the species that's interacting with the Moy Hill site. Well, you can't put true in your name and then like just disregard hundreds of years of facts. I just want to say that. And I can't even honor that statement in any other way, because there's just nothing about that I could even like respond to, because there's no facts in your true history. I did just go over the ghost species just a little bit, but let me tie it up. Or like, so what that means is that there's little flecks or little genes that we see within us that we haven't found the full genome for in the fossil record, right? So like we see little pieces of Neanderthal or Denisovan within us, but we don't find them in the fossil record, but we found them in the fossil record. And so we have their whole genome, so we know which genes match. Oh, that's a Neanderthal gene. We got ACAB from Neanderthal, right? Not literally, but ACAB every day, right? So when we're looking at that, we see little genes in our genetics that we can't find the whole genome in the fossil record, so we call them a ghost species. And there's 5 that we see within us. There's like 7 total, but there's 5 that we see within us. 3 that we see within the Kwe and the Yoruba populations in Africa, 1 within Turtle Island and Abiyali and indigenous people, and 1 within indigenous Australians. We are absolutely connected to our ancestors, whether people like it or not. Not only that, but part of being indigenous, part of adapting, right, to space, is adapting. And I actually just posted a video on this today, so it's like the last video I posted before I came live, I think. Belonging versus ownership, right? Belonging to space versus owning space. We belong to space because we adapted to that space, because that space made us. That space's interactions with us and what that space provided for us adapted us to be specific for that space. So especially when people who are in the space that they're indigenous to are interacting, there's the nutrients in that space meet the needs of that indigenous group. They might not meet the needs of the outsiders. We see this within some Turtle Island indigenous communities where they were more meat orientated than they were vegetation orientated, and so they now need they have a high protein need, right? A high animal based protein. They absolutely can't go vegan because of the fact that they have that high animal based protein meat, because they were not they did way more hunting than tending, right? Their tending of the environment was to make sure that the herd was gone, right? So, and because of that, they have a higher need for animal proteins today, right? So part of adapting to space, part of belonging to space, part of being created by space is the fact that we adapt to the needs of that space. Our body adapts to what that space can provide. Like we adapt for that space to provide tending for that space, but we also adapt our bodies to be fulfilled by that space, right? So if I have a space where, there's not a lot of water, I might develop a lower need for water. If I have a space where there's not a lot of air, I'm going to develop a different oxygenation content. And we see that within Tibetans and people in the South Pacific. And that's something they actually get from Denisovan DNA, this development for high oxygen or for lower oxygenation altitudes, right? High altitudes and underwater, so that they need less oxygen because of the fact that Denisovans be seated in low oxygenation spaces and pass that gene on to them, right? Yeah, different fuel types, different needs, right? Physicalist philosophy, I don't even know what that is. Yes, absolutely, Brett, you can. We aren't the only ones. Actually, one of the videos I did today, because I did a video on migration today because everybody had been asking me about the migration story. And so you'll see on my thing, I did a video about migration today. And in the video on migration, actually X1 is actually seen in Southeast Asia. So we're talking the Levant area, right, is where X1 is seen. So there is a spread out from there at 54,000 years ago, the break between the X DNA that we see here in Turtle Island and the X DNA that we see at the very start of X DNA. Because what it is that's the very first X DNA, and then ours is the second X DNA, and then so ours is like X2A, and then X2B is a backward migration DNA, right? I don't think I mentioned the backward migration, but I might not mention. I know I don't mention like X1A, B2, C3, right? But when we're looking at that, what we're seeing is that there's that genetic split at 54,000 years ago, and that brings us over. Then we envelop that ghost species within us. And of course, there's about 4 or 5 migration stories. So that's just the original migration, right? There's about 4 or 5 different times of migration, and there's thousands of different migration stories, but 4 or 5 different times of migration, right? And so that goes along with that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and that's so I, of course, have talked many times about the fact that we've debunked the Bering Land Bridge as the first migration pattern. But we also want to make sure, because it is important to many people, that there are many people whose migration stories actually talk about coming across on the Bering Land Bridge. So, that's not the first migration over here. That is absolutely one of the migrations over here, and we must respect that, right? We must respect that there's many different methods of migration over here, and each one of those stories is being confirmed currently by Western science. Again, This is age-old indigenous science that's been around for millennia, that was ignored for a couple hundred years, that is now being confirmed, right? So yeah, and I think honestly, when we talk about that ghost species, for me, that confirms that, or that originated without. So when we, a lot of people will like to try and trace the ghost species and who has Neanderthal and Denisovan into kind of this new concept of race, and we can't allow that to happen. Because it's not true, right? It's not a new concept of race. It's not a way to divide us. It's not like those things tell us whether or not we're more intelligent or whether or not we can feel pain, right? It's not like those things tell us that. So we can't let it take it into a new concept of division. We can understand, and the concept that we're all not the same species, right, takes it into that, right? Despeciates us, takes us into different species, right? So for me, I have a part of me that can't look at it as we're different species. So to me, when I read about the different things, or when I listen to the stories or things like that, it makes sense to me of having a species that's here, that speciates here, this Homo erectus descendant. And many of our stories talk about giants. Many of our stories talk about six-fingered people. Many of our stories have all of these different concepts that there were people already here when we get here, right? And so to me, when we envelop somebody into us, like if I or we're enveloped into somebody else, right, we become a part of that culture. And as becoming a part of those people in that culture, absolutely, if you have a ghost species DNA within you that originated here, that speciated here, you speciated here, and there is still part of you that, you know, migrated here, right? There's a part of you that speciated here and a part of you that migrated here, and it's all one. And they're both part of being indigenous, right? Coming to a space and adapting to and becoming such a part of the space is a huge part of being indigenous, right? Indigenous is only partly about who's there first, right? It's also about who is there interacting with and becoming a part of and belonging to that space, right? Which does not on any means mean that you can kick people out and decide that you're now here first and you're becoming indigenous to space. That is not what I said. It takes several 100,000 years for that to happen. Okay. But that's a part of that too, right? Is about, adapting into that space too. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's only 7 to 9 feet tall. And it's actually something that we see around the planet today. And how many times have we heard about, especially on the plains, people being over 7 foot tall? It's a well-known fact, right? Yeah. And it is. It's really about that colonization. Well, so which part, Brett? Just to double check, because I can look at that two ways, and I want to make sure that I'm looking at it the right way. Do you mean the concept of coming in and there already being another species here, or do you mean the product of colonization of the thought process? So yes, but that's not what happened, right? Okay, so let's go over really quick just the vocabulary differences of 3 different terms, right? Because they're really important for understanding. Because that was actually my first thought. I went, oh my fucking God, are we just colonizers? Is that all we do? We just colonize everything? But there's actually differences in the definitions, right? So migration is moving into a space where there's nobody else, right? Immigration is moving into a space where there's somebody else and becoming a part of the group that's there. And colonization is actually moving into a space where there's other people and replacing their culture and their government with your own culture and government, right? So if we're talking about moving into space, and when I say enveloping, what I mean is you're probably looking at maybe 10,000 people left here, right? you're not looking at a large group of people in this space, just because the way we see that Homo erectus species everywhere else, they're never large groups of people. And by the time we interact with almost all of them that we know of in the fossil record so far, what we're seeing is that everybody has shrunk down to very small populations, right? This is in part because many of these populations have already existed for several hundreds of thousands of years. Like Neanderthals were around for 300,000 years before we met them 150,000 years ago, right? So when we get here and I say envelop, what I mean is we envelop their genetics, right? When we look at the way that Turtle Island indigenous people interact with the land around them, we see that most of these things are things that we would have had to pick up from somebody else too, right? So while we might have enveloped their genetics, I don't think that we're coming in and like there's no evidence anywhere of us going into any space with these other humans and kicking them out or assaulting them into our genetics. Like there's no evidence of that. When we talk about that rise of violence at 10,000 years ago, that 2,000 prior to that includes all these other species, right? There's no evidence of that violent interaction that everybody wants to talk about. So we're not looking at a violent interaction. What we're looking at is if I go into, say, Europe and I meet up with the Neanderthals, and I'm only using this one because we actually have Neanderthals within the fossil record, okay? But say I go into Europe and I've already been interacting with the Neanderthals down in the Arabian Peninsula for 100,000 years anyways, and I'm going up and I see their cave paintings and I see their art and I see how they're using their tools, and I'm adapting my knowledge to their knowledge of space. They're like, this cave's really cool, but we've got to make sure that we have this much wood in the winter. And I go, oh, okay, we're going to have that much wood in the winter because you know this space better than me, right? And so when we're looking at the way that we see that movement across the planet, since we don't see violence in any of these spaces predating a certain time, we're not seeing a violent interaction. Colonization is a violent interaction. I'm replacing your thoughts with my own, right? And so this would indicate to me with any of the indigenous groups that we see today that have that ghost species within them, or say have Denisovan within them, right? That we're not looking at this colonization. What we're looking at is if I move into a space and maybe there's only like 300 or 400 of you here, and there's like maybe 1,000 of me coming, right? Let's go with some high numbers, right? And I come into this space, right? And there's only 300 or 400, but I'm going to ask you to teach me. No, there's not a lot of studies on that. I think we should have more. I would state that actually it probably started before that. I would state that we see the start of domestic violence when we see, actually probably in the start of the rise of hierarchy, right? Because when we start controlling other things, probably when we start to see things like slavery. Slavery is, thousands of years old. We see it in our first European cities, right? Our first cities in Eurasia, right? No, absolutely, it's totally understanding. It's totally understandable. But yeah, I would say we're probably starting. Anytime we get the idea that we can own and control other people, that's where you're going to see that rise of domestic violence, right? If I can control the land, if I can control other people, if I can control the soldiers, if I can control the city, I can control my wife, I can control my kids, right? And so I think that that's probably where you're seeing it. It's not something we see a whole lot of documentation of. I think how you would have to document that is if you had somebody who had multiple healed fractures, right? That's how you're going to document that, is if you see somebody. And even then, you're going to have a hard time deciding whether or not you're looking at, no, that doesn't mean that. Means that you're going to have a hard time looking at how they got those fractures. So if I have multiple fractures, did I get those multiple fractures because I fought as a gladiator, or did I get those multiple fractures because my husband was beating the holy hell out of me? Right. So that's a little bit hard to distinguish from a distance too. And so that might be another thing that kind of hinders that concept of study, or the studying of that concept, right? I do think, though, that, anytime we see so colonization, actually in the definition of what colonization is, it states often through acts of violence. And it's almost impossible for colonization to not happen through acts of violence. Like it's like they don't have any record of colonization without acts of violence, right? And again, this is domination and control. And so I would state that absolutely colonization has a lot of domestic violence within it. I don't know if that's when it starts, but I can tell you that anytime you have something that has a huge amount of control of others, that you're going to see a huge amount of domestic violence. Bludgeoning, yes, but then again, was it my neighbor or was it my husband? Was it an attack by a neighboring village or was it my husband? Now, I could tell if it's an attack by a neighboring village if there's multiple skeletons buried together and they're all bludgeoned. Well, this looks like war. And maybe if it's just me, but then again, was I bludgeoned because my husband or because of my neighbor, right? Yeah. That makes, I mean, honestly, that makes sense. And I'm not sure. I'm not. And again, like, I don't know on that. I would make thought processes. I would theorize based on some of the things I know that would be it. But I can't say that I know of any. And if you have specific evidence of it, then I would love to see it. Like, and I'm sure that there are ways to distinguish, right? Again, though, you like if I find a person buried, say I have a high-ranking Egyptian woman buried in a tomb, but she has multiple fractures all over her body that have healed over, like this one's 10 years old and this one's 3 years old and this one's 2 years old and this one looks like a twist fracture. That's absolutely going to be domestic violence, right? Obviously, she, she had some rank to her, so she's not out at war, right? So this isn't just a bunch of war wounds, right? And having breaks at different points of time. And certain fractures are absolutely so there's a spiral fracture type that is specific for being pulled and twisted. And actually, it's one of the ones that states that the Saruti Macedon site is actually, absolutely 130,000 years old and people there, because it is a twist fracture that happens when bone is wet. And it is absolutely an abuse fracture, actually, because what it is you're pulling and twisting and trying to break the bone, right? And so if you were to see something like that, especially something like that might have healed, then you're absolutely looking at something like domestic violence, right? I'd love to see the results. That'd be cool. So this is not a Neanderthal. This is half Neanderthal and half Denisovan. That's who's behind me. Her name is Denny. She was 13 years old when she died, and they found her from a 2-inch fragment of thigh bone in Denisova cave. Her father was Denisovan and her mother was Neanderthal. And she's a really amazing find because she's the first actual hybrid, first generation hybrid that we have. Somebody who has a parent from 2 different species. She's the first of those that we have, and we have her through DNA. It's pretty cool. This is a visual extrapolation based on her DNA of what she would have looked like. And I know she looks a little bit older than what we would think, but that's because, up to about 20,000 years ago, we actually would develop between oil and skin cells shuffling off. We developed this very thick layer on our skin to kind of protect us from the sun and stuff like that. And it actually made us look older. And so she kind of looks a little bit older. Well, I would say that they do know that her mother was Neanderthal, so her mtDNA would have been sequenced. And they do know that her father was Denisovan, so his mtDNA would have been sequenced because the man passes down his mother's mtDNA, right? So they have absolutely sequenced her DNA in full. And so because they've sequenced her DNA in full, then yes, her mtDNA would have been sequenced. She is Neanderthal on her mother's side, right? He doesn't pass down his own. He passes down his mother's mtDNA. A man passes down. So a man has an X and a Y, and he passes down the Y to his son, but he passes down the X to his daughter. And that X comes from his mother. It's a mixture of her 2 X's, one that she got from her father and one that she got from her mother. Where do you think a girl gets a second X? I have 2 X's. Where did I get 2 X's? mtDNA is the X. Mitochondrial DNA is your X DNA. It's not haplogroup X, but so it's an X and a Y, right? You're either XX or XY or some combination of the two because intersex exists, right? No, that's not how that works. Okay, that's not how geneticists have talked about it working. Your father passes his mother's X, and your mother passes a combination of the two X's that she has. I mean, as an archaeologist and anthropologist, I took genetics to learn about genetics, right? And when you're talking about genetics, that's how they trace genetics. So she has DNA from both two different species, right? When we're looking at I think we've gone over all of it. Okay, so I'll try and be back in later this week. I cannot make guarantees. I try not to because it makes it hard for me. But I am reaching kind of a time limit, so I'm going to go ahead and duck out. But I like to say a couple of things before I leave, and so you get to hear what I have to say before I leave as long as you stick around. Biologically, we're nurturing and communal. Now, why are we biologically nurturing and communal? Because biologically, we have what we call mandatory midwifery. And mandatory midwifery means that when we're born, we actually have to turn 2 times in the birth canal because of the shape of our head, the shape of our shoulders, and the cross lat to each other and the shape of the birth canal, right? And that turn that we use coming out, right, is, sorry, comments throw me so frequently. We have to have assistance in our birth. We have what we call mandatory midwifery. The only other species that's ever done this was Neanderthal, right? This mandatory midwifery means that we must have community to give birth to our children. We also have 5 stages of brain development. We call these life stages, from neonate to adult. These 5 stages of brain development from newborn or neonate to adult, 25 is the final closure of our brain, is why our brains are so malleable. And they're times of great brain development. They require a lot of nurture. They require a lot of information coming in. And we've shown that it actually takes about 30 people to raise a child healthily, to nurture a child from neonate to full brain development. Right? The only other species on this planet who have extended life stages from neonate to adult or brain development stages are like whales and elephants and bonobos. Most species on this planet actually get up and walk away the minute they're born, right? They don't have these stages where they're pretty much, we call it infant, right? Where they're unable to fend for themselves like we do, and we have extended stages. So during those times, we need an entire community to nurture us. They did studies during the 50s where they put orphans in 2 different rooms, and one set they nurtured and one set they didn't. And the set that they didn't, they fed, they changed, but because they didn't touch them and interact with them, they had what's called failure to thrive, and those infants died. So we absolutely must have nurturing from an entire community. It takes a village, absolutely. And they've proven this through science after science after science. It takes a village. We live in a timeline where we're taught that we shouldn't be nurturing each other and we shouldn't take care of each other, that we don't need community, that you shouldn't feed the homeless, that we should put spikes up, that we can exploit somebody until there's nothing left to exploit, and then we blame them for it as we discard them, right? And in this, many of us are dealing with depression and anxiety. Many of us feel like there's a problem in the world around us, and some of us actually feel like we're the problem in the world around us. And I want you to know today that those are healthy responses to an unhealthy society. You are having a healthy response and a healthy reaction to a problematic society. It is not you that is the problem. It is the world around you that is telling you that good is bad, bad is good, that love is evil, and that Meanness is actually kindness. This is meant to keep you down. This is meant to keep control of you. This is meant to keep you in a space that they can exploit you for everything you are, right? You are worthy of love just by breathing. The right to life includes all of the necessities of life. The right to life starts with first breath. It doesn't matter if you're biblical or not. The right to life, even in the Bible, it starts with first breath. So from the first breath you draw, you are worthy of everything you need to live. You don't have to do anything for that worth. And love and compassion, nurturing and empathy and community are things that you must have to be alive. They are biological imperatives to be healthy. Okay. So just by breathing, you are worthy of love. You do not have to do anything. You do not have to be anyone. You do not have to be exploitable by anyone else. Just by drawing breath, you are worthy to love. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of compassion, and you are worthy of care. If you're aware there's a problem, you're part of the solution, because only in knowing that there's a problem can we create a solution. And I have a solution: land back on a global scale. Tending and governance to Indigenous communities on a global scale, of which there are Indigenous communities thriving across the globe. Tending and governance of the space that they are Indigenous to across the globe means that we return to a communal way of life. We return to a life that provides care to every person within the community, because every person within the community matters. Provides care to every person in the community, because every person in the community matters. Okay. And tending being returned to Indigenous communities worldwide. We think of permaculture as something new, but permaculture is actually an appropriation of Indigenous agriculture. When we can marry together the modern knowledges that we have in science and the Indigenous knowledges of tending and the Indigenous science that has worked for millennia upon millennia, we can create a space that is thriving and healthy for all of us, where we all have all of our needs met, and where we might actually live past the next couple hundred years. Because at this point, we are trying to mass extinct ourselves, because, that ego tells us that, if we're going to be best at something, let's be best at killing ourselves, right? So again, land back on a global scale, returning tending and governance to Indigenous communities returns us to a communal thought process, returns us to a communal tending thought process. And if nobody has given you love today, if nobody has let you know how amazing you are today, make sure you take care of yourself and love yourself. And I love you just by existing. I love you just because you're here, just because you're willing to hear, just because you want something better, just because you know there's a problem and you want to change it. You are loved today. And many times in my life, I have thought that nobody around me loved me, only to find out later that there were people around me who actually cared. I was just so lost in my own pain, I couldn't see it. So I would challenge you that there are probably people out there that actually do love you. And if there aren't, I do. 100%. You are worthy. You are worthy of love just by breathing. Take care of yourself. Love yourself. Much love, everybody. Take care. I'll try and come back in a couple of days or whatever. I mean, I think we're heading into the weekend, so it might be next week, but we'll see. Bye, everybody. Bye, TikTok, YouTube.